I never thought my life would become a war zone over something as stupid as trash cans covered in snow. But there I was, staring at a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door on a freezing Tuesday morning in January. The paper flapped in the wind, mocking me as I tried to process what I was reading while my coffee grew cold in my hand. My name is Peter Williams, and I had been living in the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision in Boulder, Colorado, for exactly 8 months when this nightmare began. I bought my modest 3-bedroom ranch house the previous May, lured by the mountain views and what seemed like a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood. The realtor had mentioned the HOA in passing, calling it very reasonable and barely noticeable. That should have been my first red flag, but I was too excited about finally owning a home to care. The notice was from Margaret Kensington, the president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. The language was formal, cold, and absurdly detailed. According to Margaret, I was in violation of Section 7.3.2 of the HOA bylaws, which stated that all trash receptacles must be visible and accessible for collection at all times. My violation: the 2 feet of snow that had fallen over the past 3 days had, naturally, covered my trash cans. The fine was $250, payable within 10 business days. I read the notice 3 times, certain I was missing something. We had just endured one of the worst snowstorms Boulder had seen in years. The entire neighborhood was buried. My driveway was a solid sheet of ice and snow. My car was encased in a thick white shell. Every single house on my street had trash cans somewhere beneath the massive snowdrifts. But apparently, I was the only one who received a citation. I crumpled the notice in my fist and marched back inside, my boots tracking snow across the hardwood floors. My phone was on the kitchen counter, and I immediately pulled up the HOA contact information. Margaret Kensington's number was listed first, right at the top. I dialed before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the second ring. Meadowbrook Hills HOA, Margaret speaking. Her voice was exactly what I expected, sharp, clipped, and dripping with the kind of authority that came from years of making other people miserable. "Hi, Margaret. This is Peter Williams from 847 Aspen Drive. I just found a violation notice on my door about my trash cans being covered in snow." "Yes, Mr. Williams. I personally inspected the property yesterday afternoon." "You inspected it during a blizzard." The snow had stopped by then. "The bylaws are quite clear about trash can visibility and accessibility." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice level. "Margaret, we just got 2 feet of snow. Everyone's trash cans are buried. This seems a bit excessive." "Other homeowners took the initiative to clear their cans," she said primly. "The bylaws apply to everyone equally." I cleared my driveway and my walkway. I have a bad back and it took me hours. I was planning to dig out the trash cans today. "The violation has already been issued. If you feel it was unwarranted, you may appeal at the next board meeting. That will be 3 weeks from Thursday." 3 weeks. The fine is due in 10 days. "That's correct. You'll need to pay the fine first, and if your appeal is successful, you'll receive a refund." The casual cruelty in her tone made my blood boil. "This is insane. You're fining me for something completely out of my control." "Mr. Williams, if you continue to be hostile, I'll have to end this call. The HOA takes its responsibility to maintain community standards very seriously. Good day." She hung up before I could respond. I stood there in my kitchen, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to dead air and feeling my anger build like pressure in a kettle. This was my introduction to Margaret Kensington and the true nature of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. Over the next few days, I did some research. I pulled out the massive binder of HOA documents I had barely glanced at during closing and started reading. The bylaws were a nightmare of petty regulations and vague language that could be interpreted any way the board wanted. There were rules about grass height, mailbox colors, holiday decoration timeframes, acceptable vehicle types, and yes, trash can visibility. The fines ranged from $50 to $5,000, depending on the severity and frequency of violations. I also started talking to my neighbors. The Hendersons next door, a retired couple in their 70s, told me they had received 3 violations in the past year for things like leaving their garage door open during the day and having the wrong shade of brown mulch in their flower beds. The Patels across the street had been fined for parking their work van in their driveway overnight, despite the van being clearly marked with the husband's plumbing business logo. Margaret runs this place like a dictatorship, Tom Henderson told me over his fence one afternoon. She became president 4 years ago, and it's been hell ever since. Half the board are her friends, and they rubber stamp everything she wants. Why doesn't anyone vote her out? I asked. Tom laughed bitterly. You need to get 50% of homeowners to show up to a meeting to hold an election. Margaret schedules them at weird times and doesn't advertise them properly. Last year, only 12 people showed up out of 200 homes. That can't be legal. It's all technically within the bylaws. She's very careful about that. Everything she does is just legal enough that fighting it would cost more in lawyer fees than just paying the fines. I left that conversation feeling even more frustrated. This was my home, my investment, and I was apparently at the mercy of a petty tyrant with too much time on her hands. The second violation notice arrived exactly 1 week after the first. This time, it was for excessive snow accumulation on the property, creating an unsightly appearance. The fine was $300. I stood in my driveway, staring at my house, which looked exactly like every other house on the block. We were all buried in snow. The city plows hadn't even made it down our street yet. But according to Margaret, my snow was somehow more offensive than everyone else's. That was when I snapped. I had been a reasonable person my entire life. I paid my taxes, followed the rules, and tried to be a good neighbor. But this was beyond ridiculous. Margaret Kensington wanted to play games. Fine. I could play games too. I called out of work the next day, claiming a family emergency. Instead, I spent the morning researching the HOA bylaws even more carefully. I was looking for loopholes, contradictions, anything I could use. And buried in section 12.7, I found something interesting. The bylaws stated that homeowners were responsible for maintaining their individual properties, but the HOA was responsible for all common areas, which included the retention pond, the playground, the walking paths, and a large grassy area near the subdivision entrance that was labeled as community green space. The bylaws further stated that the HOA must maintain these areas in pristine condition and could not allow them to become unsightly or hazardous. There were even specific provisions about snow removal in common areas, requiring the HOA to clear walking paths within 24 hours of a snowfall and to maintain the aesthetic appearance of all shared spaces. I drove through the neighborhood, documenting everything with my phone. The walking paths were covered in ice. The retention pond area was a disaster of snow drifts, and the community green space, a large open area right at the main entrance where a fancy Meadowbrook Hills sign stood, was completely buried under snow. The HOA had done nothing to clear any of it. A plan started forming in my mind. It was petty, probably stupid, and would definitely make Margaret furious. But I was past caring. If she wanted to fine me for snow on my property, I would simply relocate all of that snow to the HOA's property. After all, they were responsible for maintaining it. I would just be helping them identify the problem. I waited until Saturday morning when I knew Margaret did her weekly neighborhood inspections. I rented a snow blower from the hardware store, the biggest one they had. Then I went home and started clearing my property with methodical precision. I cleared my driveway, my walkway, my entire front yard, the strip of land along the side of my house, and yes, my trash cans. I even cleared my back patio and the area around my shed. But I didn't just clear the snow. I blew it all into my pickup truck bed. Load after load of heavy, wet snow piled up. When the truck was full, I drove it down to the community green space and dumped it right in the middle of the grass, directly in front of the Meadowbrook Hills sign. Then I went back and filled the truck again, and again, and again. It took me 6 hours and 12 trips. By the time I was finished, there was an enormous mountain of snow, easily 15 feet tall and 30 feet wide, sitting in the center of the HOA's common area. It completely blocked the decorative sign. It was visible from the main road. And it was, by any definition, unsightly. I parked my truck in my driveway, returned the snow blower, and went inside to wait. I didn't have to wait long. Margaret appeared at my door at 7 o'clock that evening. I watched her approach through my front window, her face red with fury despite the cold. She was exactly what I had pictured. Late 50s, severe blonde haircut, expensive puffy coat, and the kind of expression that suggested she had been complaining about something every day of her life. I opened the door before she could knock. "Hi, Margaret, what can I do for you?" "You know exactly what you can do, Mr. Williams. That pile of snow in the common area is unacceptable." "What pile of snow?" I asked innocently. "Don't play games with me." "Multiple residents saw you dumping snow there all day." "Oh, that. I was just clearing my property like you asked. I needed somewhere to put the snow, and since the common area is HOA property, I figured that was the appropriate place. You are responsible for maintaining it after all." Her jaw clenched. "You deliberately created a hazard and an eyesore." "Actually, according to Section 7.3.2, I'm required to keep my property clear. And according to Section 12.7, the HOA is required to maintain common areas in pristine condition. I'm just following the rules, Margaret. Just like you taught me. This is vandalism." "Really? Is it vandalism to move snow from my property to HOA property? I'd love to hear a lawyer explain that, especially since you've fined me $550 for having snow on my property in the first place." Margaret's face had gone from red to purple. "You will move that snow immediately, or I will have you fined for every single violation I can find." "You're already doing that," I said calmly, "and I've documented everything, Margaret. Every violation notice you've given me, every inconsistency in how you enforce the bylaws, and every common area that the HOA has failed to maintain, including that giant pile of snow that's now your responsibility." "This isn't over," she hissed. "I know. See you at the next board meeting." I closed the door in her face and allowed myself a small smile. It was petty and immature, but it felt good. The next morning, I received a hand-delivered letter from the HOA attorney. It was full of legal jargon and threats, but the core message was simple. Remove the snow or face a $5,000 fine for property damage in violation of community standards. The letter gave me 24 hours to comply. I called my own attorney, a woman named Sarah Chen who specialized in HOA disputes. She had great reviews online and, more importantly, seemed to genuinely hate HOAs. I explained the situation, sent her all my documentation, and waited for her response. She called me back 2 hours later, laughing. "This is the pettiest HOA war I've ever seen, and I've seen some doozies. But here's the thing, you're actually right. The bylaws are contradictory. They can't fine you for having snow on your property during a blizzard and then claim you're vandalizing their property by moving that same snow to a common area. Plus, they're in violation of their own maintenance requirements. So what do I do? Nothing. Don't move the snow. Let them file their fine. Then we'll respond with a letter pointing out all their violations and threatening a lawsuit for selective enforcement and breach of fiduciary duty. Most importantly, we'll demand a full audit of their financials. HOAs hate audits. Will that actually work? Probably not immediately, but it will make them nervous, and nervous HOA boards make mistakes." Sarah was right. 3 days later, I received another letter from the HOA attorney, this time with a slightly different tone. They would generously waive the $5,000 fine if I removed the snow and paid the original violations within 48 hours. In exchange, they would consider this matter closed. Sarah's response was beautiful. She wrote a detailed letter outlining every violation the HOA had committed, every instance of selective enforcement, and every failure to maintain common areas. She demanded they waive all fines against me, clear the snow from the common area themselves, and provide documentation showing they had properly maintained all shared spaces as required by their own bylaws. She also formally requested a complete financial audit and copies of all violation notices issued in the past 2 years. The letter ended with a polite but firm statement that if the HOA continued to harass me, we would file a lawsuit for harassment, selective enforcement, and breach of contract. Margaret's response came not through attorneys but through escalation. Over the next week, I received violation notices for things I didn't even know could be violations. My doormat was the wrong color. My porch light was too bright. My mailbox had a small scratch on it. My house numbers were insufficiently visible, despite being the same as every other house on the block. Each violation came with a fine ranging from $100 to $300. I documented everything and forwarded it all to Sarah. "She's digging her own grave," Sarah said. "This is textbook harassment. Keep records of everything, but don't engage with her directly." The situation escalated further at the next HOA board meeting. Sarah had advised me to attend, bring witnesses, and record everything. Colorado is a one-party consent state, so I was legally allowed to record without informing anyone. The meeting was held on a Thursday evening at the community center, a small building near the entrance of the subdivision. When I arrived with Tom Henderson and 2 other neighbors who had agreed to support me, there were maybe 20 people in the room. Margaret sat at a table at the front with 4 other board members, all middle-aged women who looked like they shopped at the same boutique. Margaret's face went stony when she saw me. "Mr. Williams, how nice of you to join us." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, taking a seat in the front row. The meeting started with mundane business, approving the previous meeting's minutes, discussing landscaping bids, debating what color to paint the community center trim. Then Margaret moved to new business. "We need to discuss a serious matter involving a resident who has shown flagrant disregard for our community standards," she began, looking directly at me. "Mr. Williams has accumulated over $3,000 in fines over the past 3 weeks and has refused to comply with any of our notices." "That's not true," I said calmly. "I've cleared my property completely. What I haven't done is paid fines that were issued in bad faith." "Mr. Williams, you're out of order. Residents may speak during the public comment period." "When is that?" "At the end of the meeting." "Fine. I'll wait. Margaret continued her tirade, painting me as a troublemaker who was trying to undermine the HOA's authority. She showed photos of the snow pile in the common area, though she conspicuously avoided mentioning that it had been there for over a week now, and the HOA had done nothing about it. She claimed I was creating a hostile environment in the neighborhood. When she finally finished, one of the other board members, a woman named Patricia, spoke up. "Margaret, I drove by Mr. Williams' property yesterday. It's completely clear. Clearer than most houses in the neighborhood, actually. What exactly is he being fined for?" Margaret's expression tightened. "The fines are for accumulated violations over several weeks, Patricia. It's all documented." "Can we see the documentation?" Tom Henderson asked from beside me. "That's not appropriate for open discussion." Violation records are between the HOA and the individual homeowner. "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone, "I have copies of all my violations right here. Would anyone like to see them? There's the one for snow covering my trash cans during a blizzard. The one for excessive snow accumulation on my property when the entire neighborhood was buried. The one for my doormat being brown instead of black. The one for my porch light, which is the same bulb that was here when I bought the house. Should I go on?" A murmur went through the small crowd. People were pulling out their own phones, leaning over to look at mine. Margaret's face was turning red again. "Mr. Williams, you are disrupting this meeting." "I'm answering a question from a board member. Isn't that what these meetings are for? Community discussion." Another neighbor, a man I recognized from a few streets over, raised his hand. "I'd like to know why Mr. Williams is being fined for things that half the neighborhood is doing. My trash cans were buried in the same storm. I didn't get a violation." "Neither did I," someone else chimed in. Margaret slammed her hand on the table. "This meeting is not about Mr. Williams. If people have complaints about HOA enforcement, they can submit them in writing." "To you?" Tom asked. "So you can ignore them like you've ignored every other complaint for the past 4 years." The meeting devolved from there. More neighbors started speaking up, sharing their own stories of arbitrary fines and selective enforcement. Margaret tried to maintain control, but she was losing the room. Finally, she declared the meeting adjourned and stormed out, her board members trailing behind her like confused ducklings. I stayed after to talk with the neighbors who had spoken up. There was real anger in the room, the kind that had been simmering for years and was finally boiling over. We exchanged contact information and made plans to meet again. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I wasn't alone. Sarah was thrilled when I sent her the recording. "This is perfect. She's acting like a dictator and now you have witnesses. We can use this." "Use it how?" "To force a special election. If we can get signatures from 30% of homeowners, we can call for a vote to remove the board and hold new elections. It's in the bylaws, Section 15.4. I had read Section 15.4, but I had assumed it was one of those rules that existed on paper but never actually got used. "You think we can get 30% after this meeting?" "I think you might get 50%. People are fed up, Peter. They just needed someone to stand up first." She was right. Over the next 2 weeks, I became an accidental activist. Tom and I went door to door, talking to neighbors and collecting signatures. Almost everyone had a horror story about the HOA. The Patels had been fined repeatedly for their work van. The Johnsons had been cited for having toys in their front yard. The Reeves family had been fined for planting the wrong type of flowers. The list went on and on. We needed signatures from 60 homeowners to reach the 30% threshold. We got 93. Margaret tried to block the special election, claiming the petition was invalid due to technical errors in the submission format. Sarah shot that down with a letter explaining that the bylaws contained no such technical requirements and that any attempt to prevent the election would result in immediate legal action. The election was scheduled for 6 weeks out, giving both sides time to campaign. Margaret and her allies sent out glossy mailers defending their record and warning that outside agitators were trying to destroy the community. Our side sent out simple letters listing the fines that had been issued, the common areas that had been neglected, and the money the HOA had spent on attorney fees to fight homeowners instead of improving the neighborhood. During this time, the snow pile in the common area became a symbol of the conflict. It was melting slowly, leaving a muddy mess and dead grass. Neighbors drove by to take pictures. Someone planted a small American flag on top of it. Margaret refused to touch it, apparently believing that doing so would be admitting defeat. It sat there like a monument to petty bureaucracy. The harassment from Margaret intensified. I received violation notices almost daily. My lawn had irregular mowing patterns. My window blinds were inconsistently positioned. My car was parked 3 inches over the property line into my own lawn. Each notice came with a fine. Each fine went unpaid. Sarah assured me we would deal with them all at once after the election, but Margaret didn't stop at just fines. She started showing up at my house unannounced, claiming she needed to inspect my property. I refused to let her in, citing my right to privacy. She sent the HOA attorney after me again, threatening legal action if I didn't allow access. Sarah responded that the bylaws required 48 hours written notice for any inspection, and that Margaret's harassment was now grounds for a restraining order. Things got worse when I came home from work one day to find a boot on my car. Not from the police or a parking enforcement officer, but from the HOA. They had hired a private company to immobilize my vehicle, claiming I had excessive unpaid fines and that the bylaws allowed them to take reasonable enforcement action. That was a mistake, a big one. I called the police immediately. When the officer arrived, I showed him the boot and explained that the HOA had no legal authority to immobilize my vehicle on my own property. The officer agreed and made the HOA's hired company remove it immediately. He also took a report, noting that this could be considered vandalism or harassment. Sarah was ecstatic. They just crossed a line they can't uncross. This isn't a civil HOA dispute anymore. This is potentially criminal harassment and property tampering. We can file a police report and potentially press charges. Will that actually go anywhere? It puts pressure on them, and it creates a paper trail. If Margaret keeps escalating, she could end up with real legal problems. The day before the election, I received a certified letter from Margaret herself, not the HOA attorney. It was handwritten, which somehow made it more disturbing. The letter accused me of destroying the community, harassing board members, and conspiring with outside interests to undermine the HOA. It demanded I withdraw from the election process and drop all challenges to my fines. In exchange, she would consider reducing my total fines to a reasonable amount. The letter ended with a thinly veiled threat. Actions have consequences, Mr. Williams. I would hate to see you become uncomfortable in this community. I scanned the letter and sent it to Sarah, the police, and every single person who had signed the petition. If Margaret wanted to intimidate me, she had badly miscalculated. The letter made her look unhinged and vindictive. Several neighbors who had been on the fence about the election told me the letter convinced them to vote for change. The special election was held on a Saturday morning in March. The snow had finally melted, including my spite pile in the common area, which had left behind a muddy crater and a lot of dead grass. The HOA was required to provide a neutral location and allow all homeowners to vote by secret ballot. They rented the community center and hired an independent company to manage the voting process. Margaret and her board allies stood outside the entrance, handing out last-minute flyers and trying to convince people to vote for them. I stood on the opposite side with Tom, Patricia, who had quit the board in protest, and several other neighbors. We didn't hand out flyers. We just smiled and thanked people for voting. The turnout was massive. Over 150 homeowners showed up, the highest turnout in the subdivision's history. The voting took 3 hours. When it was finally done, the independent company took the ballots to count them while everyone waited nervously. Margaret had been president for 4 years. Her allies had controlled the board for just as long. They had established a culture of petty tyranny and selective enforcement, but when the results came back, it wasn't even close. Margaret and 3 of her 4 board members were voted out. The only one who kept her seat was Patricia, who had opposed Margaret at the meeting. The new board members were a mix of neighbors I had gotten to know over the past 2 months. Tom Henderson, Rajesh Patel, and 2 others who had been vocal about HOA reform. Margaret didn't take it well. She refused to accept the results, claiming the election was rigged and that the voting company had been compromised. She demanded a recount and threatened to sue the HOA itself for allowing fraud. The newly elected board, in their first official action, voted to accept the results and asked Margaret to turn over all HOA records, keys, and financial documents. She refused. What happened next was something I never expected to witness. Margaret, apparently unable to cope with losing control, decided to take the HOA's money with her. Over the next week, as the new board tried to transition into their roles, they discovered that approximately $40,000 was missing from the HOA accounts. Margaret had been the sole signatory on the main account, a clear violation of proper financial controls. She had made a series of large transfers to her personal account in the days leading up to the election. Tom called an emergency meeting. I attended along with maybe 40 other concerned neighbors. The mood was dark. "We've filed a police report," Tom explained. "This is embezzlement. The detective assigned to the case said they'll investigate, but these things take time." "How did she have sole access to the money?" someone asked. "We're still sorting that out. It looks like she structured the accounts improperly years ago and no one ever questioned it. This is exactly why we needed change." The police investigation moved slowly at first, but Sarah helped push it along by providing all the documentation we had gathered about Margaret's behavior. The harassment, the selective enforcement, the illegal boot on my car, and now the missing money painted a picture of someone who had been abusing their position for years. The detective, a tired-looking man named Morrison, came to my house to interview me about 2 weeks after the report was filed. I told him everything, showed him all my violation notices, and played him the recording from the board meeting where Margaret had melted down. "She's done this kind of thing before," Morrison said. "We pulled her background. She was president of an HOA in Denver about 8 years ago. Left under similar circumstances, but they didn't press charges. Looks like she just moved and started over here. Can you get the money back, if it's still there? People who embezzle usually spend it pretty fast, but we'll do what we can." Margaret was arrested 3 weeks later. I wasn't there when it happened, but Tom was, and he told me the story with barely contained glee. The police showed up at her house early in the morning with a warrant. She tried to argue that this was a civil matter, that the HOA was persecuting her for political reasons. The officers didn't care. They arrested her for felony embezzlement and took her away in handcuffs. The local news picked up the story. Former HOA president arrested for embezzlement ran on the evening broadcast. They interviewed Tom, who gave a measured statement about the importance of proper oversight and financial controls. They tried to interview me, but I declined. I had never wanted to be the face of this fight. I just wanted to live in my house without being harassed. The investigation revealed that Margaret had stolen closer to $60,000 over the past 2 years. She had used HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, vacations, and home renovations. She had disguised the theft as administrative costs and community improvements that never actually happened. The board members who had rubber-stamped her actions claimed they had trusted her and never reviewed the financial details. Margaret pled guilty to avoid a trial. The prosecutor, armed with overwhelming evidence, had charged her with multiple counts of embezzlement, theft, and fraud. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison, ordered to pay full restitution, and banned from ever serving on an HOA board again. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, called her actions a profound betrayal of the trust placed in her by her community. The HOA money was mostly recovered through asset seizure. Margaret's house went into foreclosure, and her personal accounts were emptied to pay back what she had stolen. It wasn't a complete recovery, but it was enough to stabilize the HOA finances and start making the improvements the community actually needed. The new board was a revelation. They immediately implemented financial controls, including multiple signatories on all accounts and quarterly financial reports distributed to all homeowners. They revised the bylaws to eliminate the most petty regulations and create clear, consistent enforcement standards. They established a formal process for appealing violations, with a neutral third party to review disputes. Most importantly, they actually started maintaining the common areas. The walking paths got cleared and repaired. The retention pond was cleaned up. The community green space, where my spite pile had once stood, was reseeded and turned into a genuinely nice area with benches and a small gazebo. As for my violations, they were all dismissed. The new board reviewed my case at their second meeting and voted unanimously to void all fines. They also formally apologized for the harassment I had endured, which was surprisingly meaningful. Tom even suggested they name the gazebo after me, but I declined. I didn't need that kind of recognition. I just wanted peace. Life in Meadowbrook Hills changed dramatically over the following months. The culture of fear and petty enforcement disappeared. Neighbors started talking to each other again without worrying about being reported for violations. Kids played in yards without their parents worrying about toy-related fines. The Patels parked their work van in the driveway without harassment. I settled into a comfortable routine. I maintained my property because I wanted to, not because Margaret was watching with a citation pad. I attended HOA meetings occasionally, though they were boring now in the best possible way. The board discussed actual issues like road repairs and insurance policies instead of doormat colors. Sarah sent me her final bill along with a note. "This was the most fun I've had with an HOA case in years. Thanks for standing up." Her fees were substantial, but worth every penny. She had helped me turn a nightmare into a victory. The media attention faded quickly. Local news moved on to other stories. But within the HOA community, both locally and online, the story of Meadowbrook Hills became legendary. I started getting messages from people in other neighborhoods dealing with similar problems, asking for advice. I always told them the same thing: document everything, know your rights, find allies, and don't back down from bullies. One afternoon in late spring, Almost a year after the snow incident that started everything, I was working in my front yard when a moving truck pulled up to Margaret's old house. A young couple got out, looking excited and nervous. I walked over to introduce myself. "Hi, I'm Peter Williams. I live a few streets over. Welcome to the neighborhood." The man shook my hand. "Thanks. I'm David. This is my wife, Emily. We're excited to finally be homeowners." "Your realtor tell you about the HOA?" I asked. Emily laughed. "Oh yeah, they told us the whole story. Actually, that's kind of why we bought here. We figured an HOA that just went through a major reform would be pretty reasonable." "That's a smart way to look at it," I said. "If you have any questions or need anything, let me know. People around here actually help each other now." "That's good to hear," David said. "Our last apartment had a nightmare management company. We're hoping this is different." "It is," I assured him. "Trust me, I made sure of it." As I walked back to my house, I felt a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge or victory. Meadowbrook Hills had become what it should have been all along, a community. People looked out for each other. The HOA served its actual purpose, maintaining shared spaces and protecting property values without tyranny. My trash can sat at the end of my driveway, clearly visible and easily accessible, exactly as they should be. But now no one was watching them with a citation pad, waiting for a reason to fine me. That pile of snow I had dumped in the common area had been petty and childish and probably not my finest moment. But it had also been the spark that lit a larger fire. Sometimes you have to do something dramatic to wake people up and show them that resistance is possible. The following winter brought more snow, as winters in Colorado always do. When the first big storm hit, I cleared my driveway and walkway, and yes, my trash cans. But I didn't feel resentment or anger while doing it. I was just a homeowner maintaining his property, living his life, free from the weight of arbitrary authority, and if a little bit of snow ended up on my cans before trash day, no one cared, because that's how normal neighborhoods work. Margaret served her time and moved away after her release. I heard she ended up in Arizona, far from HOAs and snow and the people she had tormented. I didn't think about her much. She had been a symptom of a broken system, and we had fixed the system. That was what mattered. The Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association still exists, of course. It probably always will. But it exists now as a tool for the community rather than a weapon against it. Board meetings are well attended and transparent. Fines are rare and justified. The bylaws are reasonable and consistently enforced. On the anniversary of the election, Tom organized a community barbecue in the newly renovated green space. Almost everyone came. Kids played on the grass that had grown over my spite pile's muddy scar. Adults stood around grilling burgers and talking about normal things like sports and work and vacation plans. No one mentioned violations or fines or Margaret Kensington. I stood with a beer in my hand, watching the sun set over the mountains, and realized this was what I had wanted when I bought my house. Not to be left alone, really, but to be part of something good. A place where people live together with respect and basic human decency. Tom walked over and clinked his beer against mine. "Hell of a year, Pete." "Yeah," I agreed. "Hell of a year. You ever regret it, all the stress and the fighting?" I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. No, it needed to happen. Someone had to stand up. Lucky for us, it was someone stubborn enough to dump a mountain of snow in the middle of the neighborhood instead of just paying the fine. I laughed. I prefer to think of it as creative problem solving. That's one way to put it. As the evening wore on and the barbecue wound down, I walked home through streets that finally felt like mine. My house stood solid and welcoming, free from violation notices and threats. My trash can sat beside my garage, ordinary and unremarkable. Everything was exactly as it should be. The fight with Margaret Kensington and the Meadowbrook Hills HOA had started over something absurd: snow covering my trash cans during a blizzard. It had escalated into harassment, embezzlement, and criminal charges. But in the end, it had become about something much bigger. It had become about community, accountability, and the simple truth that people shouldn't have to live in fear of petty tyrants. I had learned a lot over those months. I learned that bylaws are only as good as the people who enforce them. I learned that silence enables abuse, and that sometimes you have to make noise to create change. I learned that most people want to do the right thing but need someone to lead the way. Most importantly, I learned that a pile of snow, dumped in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, can change everything. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Saw the news about Margaret's sentencing being upheld on appeal. Justice served. How are things in the neighborhood? I typed back, quiet, boring, perfect. She responded with a thumbs-up emoji. I put my phone away and looked out at my street, peaceful in the fading light. Somewhere in Colorado, Margaret Kensington was dealing with the consequences of her actions. Somewhere in the state's legal system, the case of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA embezzlement was being filed away as closed. But here, in my home, in my community, life simply went on. The next morning, I woke to fresh snow. Not a blizzard, just a light dusting that made everything look clean and new. I made coffee, put on my coat, and went outside to clear my driveway before work. My neighbor across the street, a guy named Marcus who had moved in a few months ago, waved from his own driveway. "Need help?" he called out. "I'm good," I called back. "But thanks. HOA going to fine us for this?" He joked. "Not unless we want them to," I said, and we both laughed. It was a small moment, a throwaway exchange between neighbors, but it represented everything that had changed. We weren't afraid anymore. We weren't looking over our shoulders for Margaret and her citation pad. We were just people living our lives. I finished clearing my driveway and made sure my trash cans were visible, not because I had to, but because it was the right thing to do. The trash truck would come tomorrow and the cans needed to be accessible. Simple. Reasonable. Exactly how it should be. As I headed inside to get ready for work, I took one last look at the street. Snow sparkled in the morning sun. Houses stood warm and inviting. The mountains rose in the distance, eternal and indifferent to human drama. This was home. Not because the HOA allowed it, but because I had fought for it. Because my neighbors had stood with me. Because when pushed to the edge by bureaucratic nonsense and petty tyranny, we had pushed back. And it had started with snow on my trash cans, and ended with a new community built on the ruins of the old one. Sometimes the smallest things lead to the biggest changes. Sometimes standing up to a bully over something ridiculous is exactly what needs to happen. Sometimes dumping a mountain of snow in a common area is the sanest possible response to an insane situation. I would never recommend my approach to everyone. It was risky, petty, and could have backfired badly. But it worked for me, for my neighbors, and for Meadowbrook Hills. We had taken back our community from someone who saw it as her personal fiefdom. We had transformed a homeowners association from a weapon into a tool. The scars remained, of course. Some neighbors who had been close to Margaret moved away, unable to accept that she had betrayed everyone. The HOA's finances took years to fully stabilize. The bylaws required constant refinement to close loopholes and prevent future abuse. But these were the growing pains of positive change, not the slow death of submission to tyranny. Years later, when people asked me about the incident, I kept it simple. I had a dispute with my HOA, stood up for my rights, and things worked out. The full story, with all its twists and escalations and the eventual criminal charges, seemed almost too ridiculous to be true. But it was true, every word of it. And sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I would look out my window at the street and remember that day I spent loading snow into my truck. I would remember the satisfaction of dumping load after load in the common area, building my monument to absurdity and resistance. I would remember Margaret's face when she appeared at my door, purple with rage. Those memories made me smile. Not because I enjoyed the conflict, but because I had survived it, because I had won, because my home was truly mine now, not subject to the whims of a petty tyrant with a vendetta. The trash can sat beside my garage, ordinary objects that had once been the center of an extraordinary conflict. Snow would cover them again in future winters. Life would continue with its normal rhythms and seasons. But I would never forget what those trash cans represented. The moment I decided I had had enough, the line I drew in the snow. And if I'm being completely honest, part of me hoped that somewhere, someone else was reading about what happened in Meadowbrook Hills and getting ideas. Someone else dealing with an abusive HOA, an unreasonable board member, a Margaret Kensington of their own. I hoped they saw my story and realized they didn't have to take it. They could fight back. They could win. Because at the end of the day, that's what the whole crazy saga had been about. Not snow or trash cans or violation notices. It had been about refusing to accept that someone else had the right to make my life miserable for no good reason. It had been about standing up and saying no, even when it seemed pointless. The sun rose higher, burning off the light snow. I finished my coffee and got ready for another ordinary day in my extraordinary neighborhood. The HOA board would meet next week to discuss boring things like landscaping contracts and insurance renewals. My trash cans would go out on their designated day, clearly visible and easily accessible. Life in Meadowbrook Hills would continue exactly as it should. And that mountain of snow I dumped in the common area, that petty act of defiance that started everything. It had melted long ago, sinking into the ground and disappearing like it had never existed. But its effects remained, permanent and profound, woven into the fabric of our community. Sometimes you have to make a mess to clean things up. Sometimes you have to be unreasonable to restore reason. And sometimes, just sometimes, dumping all your snow on the HOA's lawn is exactly the right thing to do. I grabbed my keys and headed out to face the day, secure in the knowledge that my home was mine, my rights were protected, and Margaret Kensington would never fine anyone for snow-covered trash cans ever again. It was a good feeling. The best feeling. And as I drove past the community green space, now pristine and well-maintained, I couldn't help but remember what it had looked like with a 15-foot pile of snow sitting right in the middle of it. Ridiculous, childish, beautiful. That was the day everything changed. That was the day I stopped being a victim and became an activist. That was the day Meadowbrook Hills started becoming a real community instead of Margaret's kingdom, all because of snow on my trash cans. Some stories end with dramatic confrontations or eloquent speeches. This one ended with embezzlement charges, a prison sentence, and reformed bylaws. But the real ending was quieter, neighbors helping each other, a board that actually served its community, and the simple peace of living without fear. That was the victory. That was what mattered. That was what I fought for when I loaded up my truck with snow and drove it down to dump in the most visible spot I could find. And every single cold, exhausting minute of it had been worth it.